The strangest people are often the ones carrying the heaviest truths, and sometimes the greatest fortune in the world begins with stopping to ask a stranger if they're okay. Rain had been falling over downtown Boston since late afternoon, turning the sidewalks into shimmering ribbons of silver beneath the glow of streetlights. Most people hurried past with their heads lowered, umbrellas tilted against the steady drizzle, each one chasing appointments, dinners, or somewhere warm enough to forget the cold spring evening. Nathan Carter barely noticed any of it. At 34, he had become one of the youngest billionaires in America, the founder of Carter Biotech, a company whose medical innovations had changed thousands of lives, while somehow leaving his own feeling emptier every year. His black SUV rolled quietly toward another charity banquet where cameras, investors, and carefully rehearsed smiles were already waiting for him. His assistant had spent the last 20 minutes reminding him which senators would be attending and which reporters should receive exclusive interviews. Nathan nodded occasionally, but his thoughts drifted somewhere else entirely. Ever since his father had passed away 2 years earlier, every award, every headline, and every dollar had begun to feel strangely weightless. Success had become routine. Applause sounded hollow. Even the city that once inspired him now looked like nothing more than reflections sliding across rain-soaked glass. Then traffic stopped. A delivery truck blocked the intersection while workers struggled to move equipment through the downpour. Nathan glanced toward the sidewalk, impatient at first, until something caught his attention beneath the flickering lights outside St. Matthew's Community Hospital. A young woman sat alone on a weathered wooden bench without an umbrella. Rain soaked through her light gray sweater, damp strands of blonde hair clinging to her face as if she hadn't moved in a very long time. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She simply stared at a large white envelope resting in her lap, while silent tears blended with the rain running down her cheeks. Hundreds of people walked around her without slowing down. Some glanced briefly before continuing on. Others never looked at all. Nathan found himself unable to look away. "Sir," his assistant asked softly. "We'll be late." Nathan kept watching through the window. The young woman finally lifted the envelope, holding it with trembling hands as though it weighed far more than paper ever should. For a brief second, she pressed it against her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Then, with surprising determination, she stood and walked toward a large metal trash can beside the hospital entrance. She hesitated. Her fingers loosened around the envelope. She almost let it fall inside. Instead, she pulled it back at the very last moment, hugging it tightly before breaking into tears all over again. Nathan frowned. People didn't cry over junk mail. They didn't stand in the rain protecting something they wanted to throw away. Whatever was inside that envelope mattered enough to break her heart. "Hold the car," he said. His assistant blinked. "Sir, the gala, 5 minutes." Before anyone could argue, Nathan stepped out into the rain. Cold water immediately soaked his tailored navy coat, but he barely noticed. He crossed the sidewalk slowly, careful not to startle her. She didn't even realize someone had approached until he stopped a respectful distance away. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I know this might sound strange, but are you okay?" The young woman looked up quickly, startled by the unfamiliar voice. Her pale blue eyes were swollen from crying. Yet there was something remarkably composed beneath the sadness, as though she'd already spent years teaching herself not to fall apart completely. She offered a polite smile that convinced absolutely no one. "I'm fine," she answered quietly. Nathan had heard those 2 words from executives moments before nervous breakdowns, from patients afraid of difficult diagnoses, and from himself more times than he cared to admit. He recognized them immediately for what they were: a shield. Just then, a sudden gust of wind swept across the sidewalk. The white envelope slipped from her grasp and landed at Nathan's feet. He instinctively bent down to pick it up before rainwater could soak through the paper. The moment his fingers touched the envelope, the young woman's expression changed completely. Fear replaced sorrow in an instant. "Please," she said, stepping forward faster than before. "Don't open it." Nathan looked at the tightly sealed envelope, then back into her frightened eyes. He had no intention of reading someone else's private papers. Yet in that single heartbeat, standing beneath the cold rain outside a hospital, he realized he had just stumbled into a story far bigger than either of them understood. Claire reached for the envelope with both hands, her fingers trembling just enough for Nathan to notice, but she stopped herself before touching it. Instead, she took a slow breath as though reminding herself that panic would only make everything worse. Nathan held the sealed envelope out immediately without looking at either side. "I am sorry," he said calmly. "I was only trying to keep it dry." She accepted it carefully, almost reverently, pressing it against her chest once more before letting out a quiet sigh of relief. "Thank you," she whispered. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The rain continued falling around them while ambulances came and went at the hospital entrance, their flashing lights reflecting softly across puddles without disturbing the strange silence between two strangers. Nathan finally broke it. "You look like you needed someone to ask if you were all right." Claire managed a faint smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. "That is kind of you. But you are not all right." She looked away toward the hospital windows. No. The honesty surprised him. Most people insisted they were fine until the conversation ended. Claire simply admitted the truth, yet offered nothing more. Nathan glanced toward the building behind her. "Is someone inside?" She nodded once. "Someone important?" Another pause. "Very." Nathan did not ask another question. Years of leading scientists and physicians had taught him that silence often revealed more than pressure ever could. Claire looked at him curiously for the first time. His expensive coat was soaked. His polished shoes were covered with rainwater. Whoever he was, he had stepped into the storm for a stranger without appearing impatient or distracted. "You should go," she said softly. "Someone is probably waiting for you." Nathan almost laughed. Hundreds of people were waiting for him. Investors, reporters, politicians. None of them actually knew him. "They can wait a little longer." Claire studied his face, uncertain whether to believe him. "You do not even know my name. Then maybe we should fix that." She hesitated before answering. "Claire Bennett." "Nathan Carter." She repeated his name quietly, as though testing whether it sounded familiar, but the rain, exhaustion, and everything occupying her thoughts kept her from making any connection. To her, he was simply another well-dressed man who had unexpectedly stopped walking. Nathan noticed the hospital volunteer placing folded blankets near the entrance. Without saying anything, he walked over, accepted one with a grateful nod, and returned to Claire. "Here." She immediately shook her head. "Someone else might need it more." "There are plenty." She reluctantly accepted the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. For the first time that evening, some of the tension left her expression. "Thank you. You have thanked me twice already." "That is because people do not usually stop." Nathan looked toward the busy street, where dozens of strangers continued rushing past. "Maybe they are carrying things too." Claire considered his answer before giving a small nod. "Maybe." Another gust of wind swept through the entrance plaza. The corner of the envelope slipped open just enough for Nathan to notice a printed logo inside. It belonged to Whitmore Holdings, one of the oldest family-owned corporations in New England and one of Carter Biotech's largest competitors. He immediately looked away before he could read anything else. Claire quickly pressed the flap closed again. She noticed that Nathan had deliberately turned his eyes elsewhere. "You really were not trying to read it." "No. Most people would have. Everyone deserves one secret until they choose to share it." Her eyes softened. "You sound like someone who has secrets too." Nathan smiled without answering. Before either of them could continue, his phone vibrated for what felt like the 10th time. His assistant's name flashed across the screen again and again. He silenced the call without reading the message. Claire noticed. "You really are making someone wait." "Probably several hundred people." She laughed quietly before covering her mouth, surprised the sound had escaped at all. It was brief, almost fragile, but genuine. Nathan realized it was the first real smile she had worn since he arrived. Then the hospital's revolving doors opened behind them. A middle-aged nurse hurried outside carrying a clipboard, scanning the entrance until her eyes landed on Claire. "Miss Bennett," she called gently. "The attorney is here. They are ready whenever you are." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though she had hoped that moment would never come. She tightened her grip on the envelope until her knuckles turned white beneath the rain. When she finally looked back at Nathan, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Whatever happens after I walk through those doors, my life is never going to be the same again." Claire held Nathan's gaze for one quiet moment before giving him a grateful nod and turning toward the hospital entrance. The blanket remained wrapped around her shoulders while the white envelope stayed pressed tightly against her chest. as though it was the only thing keeping her standing. Nathan watched the revolving doors close behind her, expecting himself to walk back to the waiting car immediately afterward. Instead, he remained exactly where he was. Rain continued falling across the empty bench where Claire had been sitting only minutes earlier. Something about the encounter refused to leave his mind. His assistant finally hurried across the sidewalk, holding an umbrella. "Nathan, everyone at the gala is asking where you are." Nathan barely looked away from the hospital entrance. "Cancel my speech." His assistant stared at him in disbelief. "You have never canceled a keynote. There is always a first time. The board will not like this." Nathan smiled. Faintly. "The board will survive." 20 minutes later, after finally returning to the car, Nathan remained unusually quiet during the drive home. His luxury penthouse overlooked the Charles River, offering one of the most breathtaking views in Boston. But that evening he ignored the floor-to-ceiling windows entirely. Instead, he loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of sparkling water, and found his thoughts drifting back to Claire's frightened expression when the envelope had nearly opened. He had spent years recognizing fear in boardrooms, laboratories, and emergency meetings. What he saw in her eyes had been different. It was not fear of losing money. It was fear of losing something that could never be replaced. Unable to shake the feeling, Nathan walked into the library where only one object occupied the center shelf of an otherwise immaculate room. A small silver music box rested beneath a glass display case. He opened it carefully. The familiar melody filled the quiet apartment, soft and gentle, the same lullaby his younger sister Emily had loved before illness took her away more than 15 years earlier. His father had kept the music box beside her hospital bed every single day. After both of them were gone, Nathan became its guardian, never allowing himself to forget that wealth could build hospitals but could not rewrite every ending. He closed the lid slowly. "You would have stopped too," he whispered to the empty room. The following morning arrived bright and clear, the storm replaced by crisp spring sunshine. Nathan attended meetings, signed contracts, and approved research grants, yet every conversation seemed strangely distant. During lunch, he caught himself staring absent-mindedly through the conference room window instead of reviewing financial projections. His chief financial officer noticed immediately. "Is something bothering you?" Nathan smiled politely. "Just thinking." "About the Whitmore merger?" Nathan paused for half a second. Whitmore, the same name he had glimpsed on the edge of Claire's envelope. "No," he answered calmly. "Something else." Meanwhile, several miles away, Claire stepped out of the hospital carrying the same white envelope along with a much smaller object that never left her hand. It was an old silver necklace with a tiny pressed wildflower sealed beneath smooth glass. The necklace had belonged to her mother, and Claire instinctively reached for it whenever life became overwhelming. She boarded a city bus instead of calling a taxi, choosing a seat near the back beside the window. The envelope rested carefully on her lap, while sunlight flickered across its sealed edge. She never opened it. She simply watched the city pass by until the bus stopped outside a modest neighborhood lined with brick buildings and maple trees. Claire walked 3 blocks before arriving at a small community library tucked between a bakery and a family-owned hardware store. The building was old, the paint slightly faded, but flowers bloomed in every window box. The moment she stepped inside, an elderly volunteer looked up from the front desk with a warm smile. "There you are, Claire. We were worried about you yesterday." Claire smiled gently despite her exhaustion. "Everything is all right, Mrs. Dawson." It was another small lie spoken with kindness instead of deception. Mrs. Dawson noticed the tired circles beneath Claire's eyes, but chose not to press further. Instead, she handed Claire a stack of donated books waiting to be sorted for the free literacy program. Claire welcomed the familiar routine. Shelving books had always quieted her thoughts. As she carefully arranged novels and biographies onto wooden shelves, the envelope remained locked inside her canvas tote bag while the silver necklace rested against her heart. She hoped that if she surrounded herself with enough ordinary moments, the impossible decision waiting inside that sealed envelope might somehow become easier. She did not realize that across the city, Nathan Carter had just instructed his executive assistant to find every public community literacy program supported by Carter Biotech, beginning with one small library whose name he had never noticed before. 3 days passed, yet Nathan found himself thinking about Claire far more often than he expected. He He told himself his curiosity had nothing to do with the woman herself. It was the mystery. Why would someone leave a hospital in tears while refusing what appeared to be a life-changing opportunity? Why would a nurse mention an attorney instead of a doctor? And why had the name Whitmore appeared inside that carefully protected envelope? None of the questions belonged in his busy schedule, but none of them disappeared either. Early Friday morning, his assistant entered the executive office carrying a tablet. "I found every literacy program supported by the company," she said. Nathan looked up from his desk. "Which one receives the least funding?" She blinked. "The smallest one is Maple Street Community Library. They operate mostly on volunteers and donations." Nathan nodded almost immediately. "Schedule a visit this afternoon. Would you like the media team to come?" "No cameras." "Should I notify the library?" "No." She smiled knowingly. "You are trying something different." Nathan leaned back in his chair. "Maybe I am trying to remember what normal feels like." That afternoon, a simple navy sweater replaced his tailored suit jacket. He left the company car 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance alone. Maple Street Community Library looked exactly as he remembered from the report his assistant had shown him. It was modest, welcoming, and alive in a way that expensive buildings often were not. Children's drawings decorated the front windows, while a handwritten chalkboard outside announced a free reading hour and a community dinner for anyone who needed one. Nathan stepped inside quietly. The scent of old books, brewed coffee, and polished wood immediately replaced the noise of the city. Laughter drifted from the children's corner, where volunteers were helping several elementary school students finish homework after school. No one recognized him. For the first time in months, he appreciated that feeling. He wandered slowly through the shelves until he heard a familiar voice. "That one is a wonderful choice," Claire said warmly to a young boy holding a thick adventure novel. "Do not worry if it looks difficult. Read one chapter at a time. Stories are not races." The boy grinned. "Will you help me if I get stuck?" "Every Tuesday." "Promise?" Claire smiled. "I promise." The child hugged the book against his chest before running toward the checkout desk. Nathan remained hidden behind a nearby shelf for another moment, watching Claire organize returned books with the same quiet focus she had shown while protecting the envelope outside the hospital. There was no trace of the frightened woman from that rainy evening. Here she moved with calm confidence, greeting every visitor by name, helping an elderly man find large print mysteries, showing a teenager where to locate scholarship guides, and reminding another volunteer to save extra sandwiches for families arriving after work. She gave everyone her full attention, never appearing rushed. Mrs. Dawson noticed Nathan first. "Good afternoon." "Welcome." Nathan smiled politely. "Thank you. I was hoping to learn more about your literacy programs." Claire turned at the sound of the conversation. Recognition flashed across her face, followed almost immediately by surprise. "Nathan." He nodded. "Hello, Claire." She laughed softly. "I did not expect to see you here." "Neither did I." Mrs. Dawson looked between them with obvious curiosity. "You two have already met?" Claire answered before Nathan could. "Outside the hospital a few days ago." Mrs. Dawson smiled with gentle understanding. "Then I suppose this library is becoming smaller every day." She excused herself to assist another visitor, leaving the two of them standing beside a shelf filled with classic American novels. Claire crossed her arms lightly, still smiling. "So what brings you here?" Nathan glanced around the room. "Officially? I wanted to see one of the community programs our company supports." "Officially?" He met her eyes. "I also wondered how you were doing." Her smile faded into something quieter, but more sincere. "That is probably the nicest question anyone has asked me all week." "And the answer?" She looked toward the children reading together around a large wooden table. "I am still figuring that out." Before Nathan could respond, an elderly woman carrying several grocery bags struggled through the front door. Without hesitation, Claire hurried across the room to help, taking the heavy bags with both hands while greeting the woman by name. Nathan watched as she laughed with her, asked about her grandson, and insisted on carrying everything to her car despite the woman's protests. She expected nothing in return. Standing alone among the bookshelves, Nathan realized something that unsettled him in the best possible way. Claire had spent less than 10 minutes speaking with him, yet in that short time, she had already shown more generosity than many people he had known for years. For the first time in a very long while, he found himself wanting to understand someone not because of what they had accomplished, but because of who they quietly chose to be when no one was watching. After helping Mrs. Dawson load the grocery bags into her aging sedan, Claire returned to the library brushing a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. She looked slightly embarrassed to find Nathan still standing exactly where she had left him. "I hope you were not waiting long," she said. Nathan smiled. "Not at all. I was watching this place." Claire glanced around the room. "There is not much to see." He quietly shook his head. "I think there is more happening here than in most corporate headquarters." She laughed softly. "That sounds like someone who has spent too much time inside corporate headquarters." "You may not be wrong." Before she could ask another question, Mrs. Dawson appeared carrying a cardboard box filled with donated children's books. "Claire, could you help me organize these after we finish setting up dinner?" Claire nodded immediately. "Of course." Nathan looked toward the folding tables volunteers were arranging near the back of the library. Large pots of homemade soup filled the room with a comforting aroma, while several teenagers stacked paper bowls and fresh bread for the weekly community meal. "What is all this?" he asked. Claire smiled. "Every Friday evening we serve dinner. Anyone is welcome. Some families come because they need help. Others come because nobody should have to eat alone." Nathan watched as volunteers greeted every visitor with the same warmth regardless of how they were dressed. There were retired teachers, construction workers, college students, single parents, and elderly neighbors sitting side by side. No reserved tables. No special treatment. "How many people usually come?" "Around 80, sometimes more if the weather is cold." Nathan looked toward the serving line. "How much does it cost to run?" Claire gave him a playful look. "You are thinking like a businessman again." He smiled. "Occupational habit. About $400 each Friday if donations are good." Nathan instinctively calculated the number in his head. $400. He had approved invoices worth millions that very morning without a second thought. Yet this small amount was enough to feed dozens of people. Claire noticed the expression on his face. "Money matters," she said gently. "But people remember how you make them feel long after they forget how much something cost." Those words lingered in Nathan's mind. Without another word, he rolled up the sleeves of his sweater and walked toward the serving tables. "Where do you need me?" Claire blinked in surprise. "You want to help?" "If you will let me." Mrs. Dawson handed him a kitchen apron with a cheerful smile. "Can you serve soup?" Nathan accepted it without hesitation. "I believe I can learn." For the next 2 hours, he filled bowls, carried trays, wiped tables, and greeted strangers who knew nothing about his company or his fortune. Nobody asked him for business advice. Nobody requested photographs. An elderly veteran thanked him simply for remembering extra crackers. A little girl proudly showed him the chapter book she had borrowed. A tired mother smiled when he insisted on carrying her dinner to the table while she balanced a sleeping toddler in her arms. Nathan discovered that serving one bowl of soup at a time somehow felt more meaningful than delivering another polished speech from a ballroom stage. As the evening slowly came to an end, Claire joined him outside behind the library where volunteers were folding tables beneath the golden light of sunset. She handed him a paper cup filled with hot coffee. "You earned this." Nathan accepted it gratefully. "I'm not sure I earned anything." "You stayed." "That seems like a low standard." Claire looked toward the families leaving with bags of leftover bread and donated books. "You would be surprised how many people promise to help someday." Nathan sipped his coffee before asking the question that had quietly followed him all week. "Why do you spend so much time taking care of everyone else?" Claire rested both hands around her own cup, letting the warmth settle into her fingers. "Because I know what it feels like to hope someone will notice you." Nathan did not interrupt. She continued after a thoughtful silence. "When people are frightened, they usually think they need someone to solve all their problems. Most of the time, they simply need someone willing to sit beside them until they remember they are stronger than they feel." Nathan stared into his coffee without realizing it. Her words reached a place inside him that expensive therapy sessions and endless work had never managed to touch. He remembered sitting beside Emily's hospital bed years ago, feeling powerless because he could not fix what was happening. Back then, she had squeezed his hand and whispered that having him there mattered more than having answers. He had almost forgotten those words. Claire noticed his distant expression but respected the silence. Just before they walked back inside, her canvas tote slipped gently from her shoulder onto the wooden steps. The white envelope remained safely inside, but something else slid into view. It was the small silver necklace with the pressed wildflower beneath its glass pendant. Nathan recognized it immediately from the hospital. Claire quickly picked it up and smiled, almost apologetically. I never leave home without this. Nathan looked at the tiny flower resting inside the pendant. Someone very special gave it to you. Claire closed her hand around the necklace and nodded with quiet affection. It reminds me that even fragile things can survive much longer than anyone expects. The following Tuesday, Nathan found himself returning to Maple Street Community Library without checking his calendar first. His assistant noticed the pattern almost immediately. You have canceled 2 networking dinners this week, she said as they left the office. That is unusual. Nathan smiled while gathering a small stack of children's science books he had quietly purchased from a local bookstore. Perhaps I finally found better company. When he arrived, Claire was sitting cross-legged on a colorful rug surrounded by 8 children listening with complete attention as she read a classic adventure story. She gave every character a different voice, making the children laugh until even the shyest among them forgot to be nervous. Nathan remained near the doorway, unwilling to interrupt. One little girl looked up and noticed him first. The soup man is back, she announced with excitement. Several children turned and waved enthusiastically. Claire laughed before closing the book. Looks like you have earned a nickname. Nathan walked over carrying the books. I have been called worse. The children immediately gathered around as he placed the new books on the reading table. Their excitement over simple stories surprised him more than any business success ever had. Claire thanked him warmly. You really did not have to bring these. I wanted to. She carefully opened one of the books and smiled at the handwritten note tucked inside. It simply read, "For every child who still believes tomorrow can be brighter than today." There was no company logo, no publicity message, no signature beyond his first name. Claire looked at him with quiet appreciation. That was thoughtful. I am learning from a good teacher. The afternoon passed quickly. Nathan helped children build small paper rockets during a science activity, while Claire coached a high school student through college scholarship applications. Watching her work, he noticed something he had missed before. No matter who spoke to her, she listened as though that person was the only one in the room. She never glanced at a clock. She never hurried anyone. Her kindness was never dramatic. It was consistent. As the library slowly emptied near sunset, Claire invited Nathan to walk with her to a nearby neighborhood park where she often fed the ducks before heading home. The air was cool, carrying the scent of fresh grass after the previous week's rain. They sat together on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the small pond. Children laughed nearby while an elderly couple strolled hand in hand along the walking path. For several peaceful minutes, neither of them felt any need to speak. Nathan finally broke the comfortable silence. Can I ask you something? Claire smiled. You usually do. The day we met outside the hospital, the nurse said an attorney was waiting for you. Her smile faded, though not with anger, more with quiet acceptance. She looked down at the silver necklace resting in her hand. I wondered when you would ask. Nathan immediately shook his head. You do not have to answer. Claire remained silent for a long moment before slowly reaching into her canvas tote. She removed the white envelope that had changed everything the night they met. This time, her hands did not tremble. She simply stared at it, as though she had finally grown tired of carrying its weight alone. Do you remember what I said that night? She asked softly. I said my life would never be the same after I walked through those hospital doors. Nathan nodded. I remember. She carefully broke the seal for the first time since he had seen it. Several neatly folded legal documents rested inside, along with an old photograph of a smiling couple standing beside a little girl wearing the same silver necklace she still carried today. Claire gently placed the photograph on the bench between them. Those are my parents, she whispered. They both worked for Whitmore Holdings more than 20 years ago. Nathan listened without interrupting. Claire took another slow breath before continuing. A few months ago, an internal investigation uncovered documents proving my parents were protecting evidence of serious financial fraud before they died. They never had the chance to tell anyone what they found. Nathan looked at the photograph, then back at Claire. The attorney? He offered me $200 million. Nathan remained completely still. In exchange for what? Claire's blue eyes filled with quiet sadness, but her voice never shook. If I signed those papers, I would agree never to testify about the documents my parents left behind. The investigation would disappear forever. The people responsible would keep their reputations, and everyone would move on as though nothing had ever happened. She closed the envelope gently and rested both hands upon it. That is why I was crying outside the hospital. Not because I was deciding whether to become rich. Because I was trying to decide how much the truth was worth when everyone else had already given it a price. The world around them seemed to grow quieter after Claire finished speaking. Children continued laughing across the park. Ducks drifted peacefully over the pond, and a gentle breeze carried fallen maple leaves across the walking path. Yet Nathan heard almost none of it. His eyes remained fixed on the sealed envelope resting between them. $200 million was an unimaginable amount for almost anyone, but he understood something Claire had already learned. Some decisions could never be measured in dollars. You said no, he finally said. Claire nodded. I never signed the agreement, even knowing what you were giving up. She smiled faintly. Every morning I look in the mirror and see my parents. If I accepted that money, I would spend the rest of my life wondering whether I sold the only thing they asked me to protect. Nathan looked toward the old photograph once more. The warmth in the faces of her parents reminded him of ordinary people who had simply believed honesty mattered. Do the investigators still have the evidence? Claire gently touched the edge of the envelope. Not everything. My parents left copies with someone they trusted before they passed away. I know where those records are, but once I hand them over, there will be no turning back. Nathan remained silent for several seconds before asking, then why wait? Claire watched a little boy throw breadcrumbs toward the ducks. Because the people involved are powerful. They have lawyers, influence, and resources. I have a library card, a small apartment, and memories. Nathan met her eyes. You have something much stronger than that. What? The truth. Claire smiled sadly. The truth does not always win. Not by itself. She looked at him carefully, suddenly, noticing the confidence behind his calm voice. Nathan, what exactly do you do? He hesitated. During the past few weeks, she had never treated him differently because she believed he was simply another professional who volunteered on Fridays and donated books. He had enjoyed that honesty more than he expected, but now hiding his identity felt unfair. He took a slow breath. I own Carter Biotech. Claire blinked once, then twice. She searched his face for any sign of a joke before quietly reaching for her phone. Within seconds, a photograph from a recent business magazine appeared on the screen beside a headline featuring Nathan standing in front of his company's headquarters. She looked from the photograph back to the man sitting beside her on the bench. You are that Nathan Carter? He nodded with an apologetic smile. I should have told you sooner. Claire let out a long breath before laughing softly in disbelief. I asked a billionaire to carry grocery bags. You also handed him an apron and told him to serve soup. Her laughter grew warmer. I cannot believe this. Neither can I. The humor slowly faded, replaced by concern. Claire lowered her phone. Everything makes sense now. The expensive coat. The meetings. The phone calls. She looked down at the envelope again. Which also means you should stay away from this. Nathan frowned. Why? Because Whitmore Holdings competes with your company. If you become involved, people will say you are using my family's tragedy to attack a business rival. Nathan knew she was right. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Billionaire CEO exploits corporate investigation. Board members question motives. Investors demand answers. None of it would focus on Claire or her parents. Everything would become another business story. I can handle criticism, he answered. Claire gently shook her head. That is not what worries me. Then what does? She looked directly into his eyes. You have spent weeks showing me kindness without asking for anything in return. I do not want your life damaged because you happened to stop beside a stranger on a rainy night. Nathan felt something shift inside him. For years people had protected his money, his reputation, and his influence because they wanted access to them. Claire was the first person who wanted to protect him simply because she cared. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a simple business card, placing it beside the envelope instead of into her hand. Whether you decide to move forward tomorrow or 6 months from now, you will not face it alone. Claire stared at the card without touching it. Nathan, this is not about business anymore. Before she could answer, his phone began ringing again. This time he answered. His assistant's voice carried unusual urgency. Nathan, you need to come to headquarters immediately. The board just announced an emergency meeting. Representatives from Whitmore Holdings are here, and somehow your name has already been connected to an ongoing internal investigation. They are demanding explanations. Nathan slowly lowered the phone, realizing that the quiet promise he had just made to Claire had already begun changing both of their lives. Nathan arrived at Carter Biotech headquarters less than 30 minutes later, but the atmosphere inside the executive boardroom felt nothing like the company he had built. Normally, the room buzzed with discussions about medical research, innovation, and patient care. That afternoon, every conversation stopped the moment he walked through the glass doors. Board members exchanged uneasy glances while several attorneys sat quietly beside thick folders filled with documents. Across the polished conference table, 3 representatives from Whitmore Holdings waited with carefully controlled expressions. Nathan took his seat without rushing. "Someone said my name has become part of today's agenda," he said calmly. The chairman folded his hands. "It has. We received concerns that your recent activities may create the appearance of a conflict of interest involving an ongoing legal matter connected to Whitmore Holdings." Nathan looked around the room. Appearance and reality are rarely the same thing. One of Whitmore's attorneys leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, reports suggest you have established personal contact with an individual connected to confidential corporate proceedings. We hope you understand why this raises questions." Nathan answered without hesitation. "I became acquainted with a woman who volunteers at a community library. That is the only fact you have stated so far." The attorney offered a practiced smile. "Surely you understand that continuing such contact could become complicated." Nathan recognized the meaning behind the carefully chosen words. It was not a threat. It was pressure wrapped inside polite language. He remained perfectly composed. If kindness toward another human being creates complications, perhaps the problem is not the kindness. Silence settled across the room. Even several board members lowered their eyes. After nearly an hour of discussion, no evidence of misconduct emerged because none existed. The meeting ended with recommendations instead of accusations, yet Nathan understood the message clearly. Powerful people already knew about Claire, and they hoped distance would accomplish what money had failed to buy. That evening he drove directly to Maple Street Community Library, but the lights were already off. Mrs. Dawson was locking the front door when she noticed him approaching. "You just missed Claire," she said kindly. Nathan looked around the quiet street. "Did she say where she was going?" Mrs. Dawson hesitated before answering. "She asked me to give you something if you came." She handed him a small sealed envelope. Nathan recognized Claire's careful handwriting immediately. Inside was a single folded note. It read, "You once told me everyone deserves one secret until they choose to share it. I have decided to share mine with the people who can finally uncover the truth. But I cannot let you carry the consequences of my decision. Thank you for reminding me that goodness still exists. Please do not look for me." Nathan read the note twice before carefully folding it again. Mrs. Dawson studied his expression with gentle concern. She left early this afternoon. She seemed peaceful, but she also looked like someone saying goodbye to something important. Nathan slipped the note back into its envelope beside his business card, which Claire had quietly returned without writing on it. He smiled sadly. "She thinks she is protecting me." Mrs. Dawson nodded. "That sounds exactly like Claire." The next morning, national business news began reporting that anonymous evidence had been submitted to federal investigators concerning historical financial misconduct connected to Whitmore Holdings. Commentators debated possible outcomes while newspapers filled with speculation. Nathan ignored every headline. Instead, he spent the day making private phone calls to respected legal organizations known for protecting witnesses and preserving evidence through proper legal channels. He never attempted to influence the investigation itself. He simply ensured that anyone coming forward with truthful information would have access to experienced counsel and appropriate protection under the law. Late that afternoon, his assistant entered his office carrying another envelope that had arrived by courier without a return address. Inside was a flash drive along with a brief handwritten message from Claire. "I knew you would try to help without crossing the line. These are copies of family photographs and personal journals only. Nothing confidential. I wanted you to understand why I could never accept the money." Nathan connected the drive to his computer. Hundreds of photographs appeared on the screen. There were birthday parties, camping trips, school concerts, and ordinary family dinners. In every picture, Claire's parents smiled with quiet pride while encouraging their daughter to stand tall, tell the truth, and treat every person with dignity. Nathan realized those simple values had shaped the woman who had unknowingly transformed his own life. He closed the final photograph and glanced toward the silver music box resting on the shelf behind his desk. For the first time in many years, he understood that healing did not always begin by fixing what was broken. Sometimes it began by choosing, day after day, to stand beside what was right even when the outcome remained uncertain. 1 year later, the first warm Saturday of spring brought sunshine back to Maple Street, and the little neighborhood looked brighter than Nathan remembered from the rainy evening. That had quietly changed everything. The old library still stood proudly between the bakery and the hardware store, but the empty lot beside it had been transformed into a beautiful community learning center filled with classrooms, reading gardens, and a welcoming cafe where every child received free books, and every adult searching for a new beginning found career resources, tutoring, and encouragement instead of judgment. Above the entrance, a simple bronze plaque read, "The Bennett Family Learning Center." There were no mentions of billionaires or corporations, only a promise beneath the name. Truth plants seeds that kindness helps grow. Families filled the courtyard while children ran between flower beds carrying books almost as large as themselves. Volunteers who once struggled to find enough folding chairs now welcomed hundreds of neighbors every week. Mrs. Dawson stood near the entrance greeting visitors with the same warm smile she had offered from the very beginning. She often said that miracles rarely arrived all at once. They arrived one kind decision at a time. Much had changed during the past year. Independent investigators completed their work through the proper legal process, and the evidence Claire had protected helped establish the truth surrounding the long-hidden financial misconduct connected to Whitmore Holdings. The attempted confidentiality agreement became part of the official record, while those responsible faced legal accountability through the courts. Claire never celebrated anyone else's downfall. She simply expressed gratitude that her parents' integrity had finally been recognized. Their names, once nearly forgotten, became symbols of honesty instead of unanswered questions. Nathan also changed in ways no business magazine could measure. He remained the leader of Carter Biotech, but he gradually stepped away from endless publicity and redirected much of the company's charitable work toward literacy, community education, and family support programs across the country. Reporters often asked what inspired the unexpected shift. Nathan always smiled before answering. The most important lesson I ever learned did not happen inside a boardroom. On the morning of the Learning Center's official dedication, Nathan arrived carrying a small wooden box wrapped with a simple blue ribbon. Inside rested the silver music box that had belonged to Emily for so many years. He had spent months deciding whether he was truly ready to let it become part of someone else's story. As he entered the new building, he found Claire arranging children's books on low wooden shelves exactly as she had done in the old library. Some things, he realized, should never change. She looked up and smiled, and the quiet warmth in her eyes reminded him of the very first genuine smile she had shared after handing him a cup of coffee behind the library months earlier. She walked toward him, the silver necklace with its tiny pressed wildflowers still resting around her neck. "You made it," she said softly. Nathan laughed. "I would not have missed this for anything." They spent the afternoon greeting families, reading stories to children, and watching neighbors explore every corner of the new center. As the celebration slowly came to an end, Claire suggested taking one last walk before sunset. Without discussing it, they followed the familiar streets until they reached the same weathered bench outside St. Matthew's Community Hospital, where rain had once fallen around two strangers who believed they would never see each other again. The bench had recently been restored, but it remained in exactly the same place. Nathan looked at it for a long moment before opening the small wooden box. Claire immediately recognized the delicate silver music box inside. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It belonged to my sister." Claire looked at him with gentle surprise. "You never told me that." For years I believed holding on to it was the only way to keep her close. Then I met someone who reminded me that love is not preserved by hiding it away. It grows when we share what it taught us. He placed the music box beside her old white envelope, which she had brought with her that afternoon. The envelope no longer carried fear. It carried history. Claire smiled before reaching inside and removing a single folded sheet of paper. "There is one last thing I never showed you." Nathan unfolded it carefully. It was a handwritten note from her mother, dated years before everything had changed. The final sentence read, "The greatest inheritance you will ever receive is the person who sees your heart before learning your story." Nathan felt his eyes grow warm as he looked back at Claire. Without grand speeches or dramatic gestures, he reached gently for her hand. "Claire Bennett, before I knew your name, your past, or your courage, I only knew that I could not walk away from someone sitting alone in the rain. Every day since then has convinced me that stopping was the best decision of my life. If you are willing, I would like every tomorrow to begin beside you." Claire smiled through quiet tears, the kind that no longer came from fear, but from peace finally earned. "Yes," she whispered. As the evening breeze carried the familiar melody from the silver music box across the quiet hospital courtyard, the old envelope, the pressed wildflower necklace, and the treasured keepsake from Emily rested together on the bench where their journey had begun, silent reminders that kindness had opened the first door, truth had carried them through the hardest one, and love had been waiting patiently on the other side all along.